Hi, everyone, and thank you for listening to the Essential Antitrust Podcast. I'm Jenn Mellott, a partner in Freshfield's antitrust practice in Washington and Brussels. In our last episode, we unpacked what the European Commission's new EU merger guidelines mean for deal makers, the new efficiencies framework, the expanded theories of harm, and what all of that means for deal planning. Today, we are taking the conversation one step further. Rather than discussing the guidelines from the outside in, we are once again going directly to the source. I am thrilled to be joined once again by Daniele Calisti, the head of the Unit for Merger Policy and Case Support at the European Commission, who, as our regular listeners will know, has been at the very heart of this reform. Also with us again is Dave Foster, an executive director at Frontier Economics in Brussels and London. And last but not least, since we're getting the whole gang back together, I am joined by my partner, Thomas Janssens from Brussels, who will bring the day-to-day EU practitioner view. Thanks for joining us again, Thomas. And why don't I kick it to you to start us off?
Thank you, Jen, and welcome also from my side to Daniele and Dave. It's been exactly 12 months since we had both of you here on our podcast, just after the Commission had launched its public consultation on the merger guidelines review. So first of all, I would say congratulations are in order to Daniele for getting to this stage in what Brussels insiders will recognize is record time. So Daniele, now that the draft is published, what was the single hardest issue your team had to navigate in getting to this stage?
It's a very good question. I hope the answer won't be underwhelming. I think it's not about a single issue, but more something about the broader exercise. I was surprised during last year's consultation on what we had to achieve with the reform of how much people were used to the old text, even among the people that were drafting it. I mean, there were a dozen people here working on it. And also, when you speak to lawyers and consultants, they had the text that they recognized and, they were used to, and they even liked it to a great extent that, we did not expect this much support. When we then started the exercise, we had to combine the horizontal and the non-horizontal merger guidelines and also accommodate a more dynamic framework and do this in a fresh text. So the issue we had was how to devise the right architecture to put all of this together in a way that allows you to deliver a coherent text, which, however, can also maintain some of the concepts which gained popularity over 20 years of enforcement, case practice, and case law. So I think that was the most difficult challenge, and the jury is still out, I guess, on whether we have achieved a good result. But it explains why the entire architecture of the text is a novel one, yet it feels familiar to the practitioners or those who are commending it.
Well, thanks for that, Danielle. And I don't know that it will be actually that much of a surprise to any practitioners that actually structuring the draft is sometimes the hardest part of any of these processes. But maybe walking through the guidelines themselves, I mean, obviously, efficiencies are one of the hot topics here, and perhaps the area where the guidelines showed the most dramatic shift from prior practice. And I think one of the common criticisms that you hear in the bar for running a successful efficiencies defense is that the bar historically has just been too high in practice, and that the efficiencies defense is something that is theoretically possible but never actually achievable. But in the new guidelines, we see this kind of theory of benefit framework. The commission has been very vocal about welcoming those arguments. Dave, it'd be good to hear from you to start on this. Talk to me a little bit about how you see this new framework. Do you think that it changes the game? How are you looking at this from an economics perspective?
In a word, I think yes, it really does, from my point of view, change the game. I think it is a big shift. And maybe start by sort of standing back and say, actually, the guidelines as a whole, the new guidelines as a whole, from my point of view, are a fantastic piece of work. I mean, real credit to Daniel and the team. Daniel, you just mentioned architecture. I mean, the thought that came to my mind was it's like one of these major house renovations where someone says, I want all the modern conveniences. I want a complete ground up renovation. But, I want to keep the kind of look and feel of the old house. And that is extremely hard to pull off. But, the really flash new piece of technology in this rebuilt house, for all it does retain some of the charm and character of the original, is the benefits section. And of course, you can say, well, efficiencies were there in the old guidelines, and there are some skeptical voices who say, maybe things won't change that much. But I think centering the theory of benefit in this way for me, is a big shift. And maybe a question to you, Daniel, that sort of builds on that is, there was this view we were sort of, arguably sometimes stuck in a bad equilibrium on efficiencies where people didn't put them forward because they thought they wouldn't succeed, and then poor old commission doesn't have cases with which to work and build precedent around efficiencies, and they're not necessarily therefore used. Do you think that is something that you're now expecting to see shift?
First of all, thanks for the kind words. I think it's the first time that we can have some agreement and common ground on efficiencies, hopefully. And, you call it a bad equilibrium. I would call it a bit of a chicken and egg situation, depending on what perspective you take in the discussion, because the Commission was often accused of not taking efficiencies seriously. Yet I can tell you that of the hundreds of cases that I worked on as a case manager before I took this job, I mean, I've not seen a lot of efficiency submissions. So you speak to lawyers and then they tell you that, of course, they don't advise clients to come up with the claims because they would not be useful anyhow, or they would be seen as a bit of an acknowledgement that there is a problem with the merger in the first place. So, it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. So if you look at the draft, you see a lot of things. Maybe we'll go into it in more detail later, but we acknowledge a longer time frame for efficiencies. We put out a taxonomy, a quite rich taxonomy of the benefits that mergers can bring. We have a dedicated framework for dynamic efficiencies. We have clear statements on the symmetric burden of proof and so on and so forth. And I guess that the idea of a theory of benefits is underpinned by some of these novelties, and it brings them together because what we wanted to do is to work not only on the substance, but also on, how we frame the conversation of efficiencies to have a bit of a reset of the conversation so that we would have a new way to deal with this in our process. And I think that that's what you also underline, which makes me particularly happy that this was well received.
Building on that, Daniele, on the symmetry point which you mentioned, clearly in the past, one of the persistent criticisms of the Commission's framework was that the merger specificity analysis was disconnected a bit from sort of the counterfactual, holding on the one hand efficiencies to a hypothetical standard, while on the other hand, theories of harm were being grounded more in the real world. I would say the new guidelines take a positive step towards closing this gap by expressly applying to both theories of harm and theories of benefit the same more likely than not standard of proof and the same evidentiary principles. But at the same time, some of the asymmetry you've seen, you could say, seems to still be there in the draft. I'll explain what I mean by that. The guidelines suggest the Commission will work from a real-world counterfactual, but for the parties' theory of benefit, the merger specificity test still requires them to show, arguably, a more hypothetical counterfactual. So it strikes me that maybe the gap is narrower than before, but not yet fully closed. Daniele, in your view, is the gap fully closed, or is there still some degree of asymmetry that's sort of inevitable?
I think in terms of the burden of proof, I do agree with you that, the draft is very clear. The burden for the theory of harm and the theory of benefits is drafted almost word by word in the same way. So I think, this is the clearest message that on that we carry the same burden. And that's something that had been widely advocated for in the public consultation. When it comes to what is your reference point, I guess that your point is that we test the merger against whether there is the benefits can be achieved through an alternative to the merger. That's what you described in your question as hypotheticals against real world or market realities. But I think here the gap is reduced. To some extent, there is a gap, but the way that I would describe it is that obviously a merger, as somebody said recently, a merger is forever. So you want to make sure that the benefits that the merger can deliver could not be achieved in ways that do not affect the structure of a market on a lasting basis, of course. But if you read the text of the guidelines, of the draft guidelines, you will find precisely that we have made an effort not to require that the companies benchmark these benefits against what are mere hypothetical or speculative alternatives. But we have tried to anchor the standard to alternatives which are credible in the real world based on real market dynamics. So I think that there as well, we have made an effort, even if I think in the early conversation of the guidelines is not being widely acknowledged.
It's an interesting conversation, Danielle, and I think we probably could talk about efficiencies all day long, and we'll continue to talk about efficiencies with these new guidelines for quite some time. But I do want to make sure we also have time to talk about the other side of the coin, the sort of sharper teeth in the guidelines, the new theories of harm that we see. I wonder, Thomas, you maybe want to start us off on that.
The new draft text gives much more prominence to dynamic theories of harm. Loss of investment competition, loss of innovation competition, entrenchment, dynamic foreclosure. Now, none of these theories are really new in terms of the Commission's enforcement practice, but the common theme here seems to be that the Commission wants to look beyond static price effects. Daniel, is that a fair summary?
I think it is a fair summary, and in a sense, this is a direction of travel that some of our recent case practice had already flagged, that we wanted to start to look at more dynamic settings, also when it comes to potential harm that comes from mergers. The difference of the new text is that it now gives us more space to have a conceptual discussion on what are the criteria according to which we can intervene in these situations. But I want to also give a bit of a reassurance on that. I think it's not that we're gonna reinvent the wheel in every case. I mean, after all, more than 90% of mergers get cleared unproblematically with static criteria. So we don't want to reverse that. But in cases where we do have industries where these parameters of competition are important, where we want to look at innovation and investment because they're important parameters of competition, we now have better tools to try to shape our assessment. And that in a way that also makes it more predictable for businesses.
And Daniel, one of the things you mentioned there was the loss of innovation competition theory of harm, which is now very clearly laid out in the new guidelines in a way that was there in the Commission's case practice, but not set out in the same way in the old guidelines. And maybe one of the important questions there is how these innovation theories of harm are going to be assessed in practice. I think particularly in the area of what's described in the guidelines as loss of general innovation competition. And the guidelines talk about assessing firms' capabilities and track record and so on. In terms of the sort of evidence that the Commission might be interested in cases where those concerns are relevant, what pointers can you give people on how the Commission might assess the evidence there?
It is true that it is one of the areas where we have worked the most on the framework. And I think obviously the specifics of each industry will come into play when we will look at this going forward. I think if also the past practice is any indication, clearly, as I mentioned before, this is not going to be something that we will look at in every case. So you have to first look at the characteristics of an industry, how much innovation plays a role in the competitive dynamics of that industry. So that I think is the first pointer. The second is the level of concentration among companies which have certain capabilities in that industry that can bring, that rivalry that can generate the innovation race and can be relevant for the innovation race. So, the level of concentration in an industry is going to also be a pointer. So these two factors are going to give you already a good indication of when this is going to be relevant. The rest, I think, the evidence is actually, we've looked at past cases of, different proxies depending on the different industries. We will have to adapt our assessment also to the specific characteristics of an industry, because when we have a conversation about innovation, I think a key thing that we have in these guidelines is that we look at this phenomenon as if it's just the same concept, but there are industries that function in a very different way. You have pipeline industry where you have a way of looking at that, which can be familiar from our pharmaceutical cases, where you look at different stages of the pipeline and that tells you something. But there are other industries where innovation doesn't happen in that way. So that's why I think that the discussion around capabilities and these general industry features are going to be more relevant.
A lot of conversation there about the theories, but of course, we also need evidence. And one of the things that is interesting to me in the new guidelines is this differentiated evidential standard that comes out of the guidelines. Maybe, Thomas, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, Jen. And yeah, obviously, it would be interesting to see whether Daniele even agrees with a reference to a differentiated evidential standard. But I'll explain a little bit what this is about. So the guidelines introduce a standard that is calibrated to market concentration levels and market shares. So at the low end, that is at combined shares below 25%, In order to establish a significant impediment on effective competition, the Commission must rely on substantial additional corroborating evidence. But at the high end, so combined shares above 40% or post-merger HHI above 2000, the dynamic does reverse. The Commission can lean heavily then on structural indicators, and it is for the parties to produce substantial evidence pointing away from a seek. Now, the guidelines are careful to say this is not a formal legal presumption, and that is consistent with the EU court case law. But from where we sit as advisors, the difference seems to be narrow, potentially in practice. Some have even been calling it a shadow presumption. Daniele, can you maybe explain a little bit the thinking behind this? And also, is this different from what the Commission was doing in practice before? What does substantial evidence pointing away from a seek actually look like in concrete terms?
No, thanks. It's a very interesting question, and I think it's a clear case of seeing the glass half empty or half full. And I hope that, by explaining how we got there, I may also reassure you a little bit. I think if there is an important novelty of these guidelines is that I think also when it comes to market power, they give you a basket of criteria that move away from the typical analysis that is, centered around market shares and market shares only. So I think that the first idea of these guidelines is that we don't just look at market shares, we look at a number of other things. Now, you may want to reconcile that with the fact that with the dispose of many cases, as you also said, below 25%, or, with our simplified framework by looking at these market shares. So that leaves you in this situation where now that we have a lot more things to look at, which are not strictly speaking structural or old style, without having any judgment of value on that old adjective, how much do we expect the parties to bring? And I think that the idea is that we are on a sliding scale. The more your position is important on the market, the more we will also look at other things to be reassured that there is no issue with the case. I think that if you want to see the glass half full, this essentially means that it's not that in every case we will have to expect the parties to produce a lot of different items for us to run the assessment, because we can be comforted that probably the indication of market position also cohering with what we do in our simplification, cohering with what we do with our safe harbor at 25%, will be sufficient for us to conclude that there is no issue. Whereas the more there is a stronger position on the market, the more we will also look at other things without it being necessary that we have a lot of different parameters in every single case, which can be particularly useful if you've done, as I'm sure you have, like these cases where you have potentially hundreds of relevant markets and you have, a lot of different market shares on all these markets. And we had in practice also in the past said, well, okay, let's try to go about it in a very step-by-step fashion. Namely, when we have a higher market share, we will also look at other things to see if prima facie we have to investigate this more or not. And so the approach doesn't change. I think it just gives it a bit more transparency and structure on how to deal with this pragmatically on a case-by-case basis.
That's really interesting to hear, Daniele. And happy to take the glass half full as a starter. Dave, I'd be interested in hearing your perspective then on how you get sort of to a full glass in terms of sort of practically how should parties in complex transactions going forward structure their submissions, and how will that, you think, be different from what we've been doing before to sort of show the positive economic evidence?
Yeah, it's a great question. And in some sense, I think it's what's there in the guidelines is an endorsement of perhaps something that we've felt for a while, which is just how important it is to have the positive case for a transaction when you are in the zone of higher structural indicators. And I read those sort of guidelines on market shares as a little bit like you're in the low and moderate bucket. You don't really need a positive case as such. You can sort of play the old-fashioned game of just making sure that there's no skeletons hidden in the closet. When you're in the material bucket in the middle, where no presumption kind of either way kicks in, it's a sort of fair fight. But it would still be quite nice to have the positive case on the table and in the mix. And if you are in the high or the very high buckets, then it is absolutely essential to have the positive case for the transaction on the table. And that may be a strong efficiencies and benefits story, as it was, for example, in the Vodafone 3 merger in the UK, which is another case of the positive story overturning a structural presumption. There may be arguments in there around global markets and the competitors of Europe in those global markets, about the sustainability financially of the sector. It's interesting the guidelines now bring in the concept of sort of access to finance as something that Europe may now be concerned about, which was clearly a big part of the Draghi report and so on. So absolutely essential in that zone to have the positive case very clear from day one.
Well, let's broaden out for a moment. I think, the guidelines talk quite a lot about resilience, which is a concept that feels, I think, really sort of new for a merger control document, but it features pretty pervasively throughout the guidelines as one of the parameters of competition. We've seen some statements from Commissioner Rivera, who's described it as part of a sharper instrument to support Europe's competitiveness. And so, Danielle, I'm interested to hear you tell us a little bit more about how the Commission sees resilience fitting into the competitive assessment. Is it a standalone consideration? Does it sort of operate through one of the other theories of harm? Is it a type of efficiency? How should practitioners be thinking about those arguments?
It's one of the key concepts that characterize these guidelines, and it will not be a surprise because it's been part of the debate since our public consultation on the review process. The difficulty there was to essentially define the concept and make it such that it could fit in the framework, because what we have also seen in the public consultation is that resilience has been defined by many people in many different ways, and people see into this concept many different things. So I think one thing that was important for us is that if I can draw a parallel with the issue of sustainability, I think we approached it roughly in the same way, which is to say, it's not that we now decide that this is important, so we're going to change our whole approach to fit our new objective. It's rather that we realize that this has become important. This has become a market reality that is important for companies on the supply and on the demand side alike. So we have to explain how this may enter our assessment because it is a market reality. And that's how you will see it on the guidelines. There's an attempt at defining resilience in a way that, can underpin the assessment in the old text. But when it comes to the actual theory of harm and the efficiencies, I think that what we try to do is to describe concretely how some resilience consideration can turn into market realities and parameters of the assessment that then can enter our analysis. So it is not that we have an abstract concept that can become a self-standing theory of harm. There's a harm to resilience, which is constitutive of antitrust harm. But we rather explain in these guidelines, or we have tried to explain in these guidelines, how it can be a parameter of competition in many circumstances, which can then enter the way in which we assess both the harm and the benefits of a merger.
Probably one of the most sort of direct statements I think we've seen was when Commissioner Rivera wrote in the Economist newspaper recently that Commission be open to clearing a deal where the longer term benefits to consumers outweigh shorter term harm. And you've spoken already about how the framework of that assessment is still very much going to be the consumer. This is not about sort of measuring benefits to companies, European or otherwise. We still have to connect these benefits to consumers, but we're now thinking short and long term, and there may be cases where that balancing needs to happen. When you have a case where there is some evidence of short-term harm, but there is strong evidence of long-term benefits, what are you looking for from parties in terms of evidence of how to do that balancing exercise? Is it as simple as, well, if the benefits are long-term, convince me that they really substantially outweigh the short-term harm, or is it a more fine-grained balancing act than that?
It's one of the most difficult questions that these guidelines have to answer. And I think that, in the last part of the guidelines where we talk about the balancing, we have tried to provide certain criteria for all these situations where you do not have a perfect symmetry between the harm and the benefits that you have to gauge. I think for both the harm and the benefits, obviously there are certain parameters and certain criteria that we have to look at. And, but if we assume that, these are met, then of course we enter the balancing territory. What is important is that, and the first question that we will have to address, be they resilience benefits or other types of benefits, is whether they can be quantified or not. That's going to be the first issue, because obviously, if they are susceptible of quantification, it makes our job easier. If they're not quantifiable, we still have to look at an order of magnitude of these benefits, whether they happen in the short term or in the long term. And that's going to be important to make them comparable in a way to the harm that we're trying to address. And I think that the guidelines also open to the idea that there can be certain types of benefits that also, when it comes to resilience, that are out of market benefits that can be considered into our balancing, provided that, there is a compensation of the harm that is suffered by the customers that are affected by the merger, with certain specific parameters which we have tried to detail in line with what has been already done in other areas of antitrust enforcement. So it is difficult to do this in practice, but I think that what is comforting is that when we have researched for our guidelines, we have seen that there's a lot of parameters where economists are doing a lot of efforts to try to make them quantifiable or easier to apprehend, also in a quantitative way, in a way that would allow us to make this balancing. Obviously, the sliding scale principle remains relevant, right? So I think that when you have a significant change in the structure of the market and a significant harm, you would expect that the benefits are significant enough for you to be comfortable that they can get the merger approved.
Maybe talking about sort of broader policy objectives, there's also been quite a positive buzz around the innovation shield, Daniele, and the guidelines use the language that the Commission, in principle, does not find significant impediment to effective competition in relation to any theory of harm where the shield conditions are met. So that is almost as close to a safe harbor as you can get without changing the legislation, I guess. At the same time, the conditions raise perhaps some practical questions. What is a small innovative company? There's a question about sort of the designated DMA gatekeepers not being able to rely on this carve out. So ultimately, it seems that the practical value of the shield will depend on how the Commission will apply the conditions in the real world. And that is something I think which deal makers will be watching very closely. Daniel, can you maybe explain a little bit the policy rationale for the innovation shield? How did you get there in terms of the draft? And how do you also see it interacting with innovation competition more broadly?
I think that the way you described it, Thomas, as a form of safe harbor is how Vice President Rivera is envisioned it. I think that her idea was precisely that as we are trying to enter into an era of a more dynamic assessment, we want to make sure that we do not create uncertainty in situations in which companies would not have expected us to intervene in the past. So, in a way, everybody's familiar with our safe harbors in a static context. Let me put it that way. But when you enter a dynamic world, when can you be sure that what you're doing is not going to raise competition issues? And she wanted to give a signal that we wanted also to give some clarity on that front. Now, this was the objective. What you say about the implementation of this safe harbor is also relevant. I think, we have a lot of practice over the past 20 years of the application of the static criteria to the safe harbor, which help practitioners navigate this. We will probably have to gain some experience on this to create more comfort. Overall, there are, even in the application of a simple market share threshold, there are some difficulties in how you define the market, what type of shares you use, etc., etc. But everybody would agree that simplification managed to create a practice where it's easy for practitioners to navigate this. I think that Clearly, we are navigating new waters, and we will need also some practice here, but that's exactly what we are trying to achieve, to create a safe harbor also for a dynamic setting. Now, this is where we are probably the first agency worldwide to try to do this. And so I would accept if, in the public consultation, people say, well, there are some criteria which can be better defined, there are better ways to achieve it, but we are already pretty proud of having come up with this solution to offer some certainty to companies, particularly when it comes to the theories of harm on the innovation side.
Daniel, maybe one of the things that will prove to be most critical in that both for that safe harbor, but also for assessing the innovation theories of harm we were talking about earlier, is this concept of your market share outside the traditional product space, market share in an innovation space, and there really aren't clear-cut indicators from precedent as to exactly what the right metrics there are. Even sort of from a risk assessment perspective, firms trying to understand whether they can avail themselves of this safe harbor. Do they feel relatively safe, do you think, if they've sort of looked back through all of your case practice and thought, well, if I think about all the different metrics that the Commission has thought about in the past and apply them, I feel like I'm relatively safe here? Or again, maybe just to return to that point you previously made, sometimes they were thinking about the real specifics of an industry and understanding what the right metrics are and what the balance between those two things maybe is.
It's a pertinent question, and I think this is our attempt at creating something that can be applied as a threshold, but then of course populating this threshold with numbers that can pertain to specific industries where it is more challenging. We have some precedent for certain industries which offer some comfort. I think that there are some industries where it's going to be easy to identify what is a share in the innovation space, or there's another criterion there, which is essentially how many credible competitors there are in that innovation space, which will make it easy to apply this shield. There are other industries where it may be more difficult. So that is why, I accept that devising this criteria in a general fashion that can apply to a different range of industries where innovation could be a pertinent concern is difficult. Practice will bring more clarity here. But if there are ways or suggestions, particularly from market participants in specific industries, or how to better hone this criteria, I think this is an area where we are extremely open to listen to any suggestions on how to make them easier to apply in practice. Again, we're trying this for the first time. We don't have the arrogance to think that we got it right the first time, but that's what the public consultations are for.
Before we can move on to takeaways here, there is one part of the guidelines that we haven't touched on yet that I want to make sure we hit, which is, for the first time, the guidelines have some pretty detailed guidance on when and how member states can use their national FDI powers to intervene in mergers that fall under the Commission's exclusive jurisdiction. And Thomas, when you and I were talking about the guidelines, I think this was something that had caught your eye.
Absolutely, it did, Jen. I think it's really genuinely significant for anyone doing cross-border deals in Europe, and especially where some of the broader policy objectives we've been talking about come into play. So, in a way, for 90 pages, the draft guidelines talk to companies and their advisors. And then for the last 10 pages, they turn towards member states and in a way put the member states on notice in relation to essentially rules on proportionality, non-discrimination, what are recognized interests that member state can defend, but where does the Commission draw the line? And for practitioners, that's really very welcome. We have seen transactions delayed or effectively derailed by national interventions that in a way looked more like industrial policy than genuine concerns. And having a structured framework which pushes back against that, with the Commission as a potential ally, it seems, based on these guidelines, it, to my mind, might really change the dynamic. So, Daniele, it would be interesting really to hear from you how you came in putting the draft together to a point where it was decided to indeed include this in these guidelines, and then also what we should expect from the Commission in terms of enforcement going forward.
I think that the demand for this came from the public consultation, where a lot of businesses made us aware that there was an erosion potentially of the one-stop shop principle, and that advising on a deal was becoming increasingly complex because of these national reviews and the potential grounds on which there could be conditions imposed on a merger, even when the commission found it to be unproblematic. The untold story here is that there's more to this than the practice you see from the Commission in actual Article 21 decisions, because there's many more times that the Commission engages and has discussions with member states. And one thing we discovered in these discussions is that in certain circumstances, both parties and national authorities are not aware of the full complexity of the case law that there is on this issue and the decisional practice that there is on it by the Commission. So I think what we wanted to do is to, obviously, we cannot affect the legal obligations of member states with this text, but what we can do is to put in one place, in a single place, all the rules that have been developed also through the practice, so that member states can have in one place the full range of criteria that can be applied to this type of procedures, in a way that there can be a constructive dialogue also between member states and the parties to national proceedings when Article 21 can be of application. I think it's a key part of the draft that goes a bit in the same direction. I think as we think of potential scale that is built in the internal market, I think clearly this is also one of the things that we wanted to address. And while not creating new obligation for member states, I think that the clarification of the framework could be helpful for businesses and also member states.
Thanks, Daniele. And unfortunately, we are getting to the end of our time here, and we have covered a huge amount of ground today, from the theory, from the practice. But I do want to bring it back to the practical and round this out with a takeaway from each of you. And Dave, maybe I can pick on you first. What for you is, if we boil this all down, the single most important analytical development in these new guidelines from the economist perspective?
Great question. And, the economists kind of get everything on their Christmas list with these new guidelines, because there are a great many interesting economic questions to be answered that are raised by these guidelines. But I mean, without a doubt, for me, the taxonomy of benefits that Daniele talked about at the top of the podcast, I think is the most important analytical contribution from my perspective, and that will create the most change as a result of the new guidelines.
Thanks, Dave. And Thomas, you're not off the hook here. So if you draw on experience with clients before the commission and looking at cases like Vodafone 3, you're sitting here, you're looking at these new guidelines. What's the one thing that you're telling your client deal teams to do differently starting today?
The one thing I would say, Jen, to deal teams is this: the new framework rewards early preparation and also early and open engagement with the regulator. Even more than before, I think, in any complex transaction, we should be affirmatively building the case for clearance from day one. And so that means not only mapping potential theories of harm, ensuring that evidence on efficiencies is robust and thorough. You also need to build your theory of benefits, so the affirmative case for clearance, and it now can also include broader policy objectives, as long as it's credible, of course. And all of that needs to be done really before you go in and see the regulator, not in response to an issue being raised. I think that would be my main takeaway and advice.
Thanks for that, Thomas. And Daniele, I think it is only fitting that we end the podcast with a final word from you. So sitting here, what in your mind is the thing that the commission most wants parties and practitioners to take away from this new framework?
I think before we discuss what they can take away from the new framework, the main message from me is that this is not yet set in stone. I think we are entering a phase of public consultation where we really are eager to listen from all the stakeholders about these guidelines and about how to even improve them. we clearly engaged very seriously with all the expectations that there were out there and with all the issues that we heard in the public consultation. And I think that we are particularly proud that all of the issues that were put on the table were discussed very openly, and there's something for each of those issues in these guidelines. So it's a rich text. There's a lot of things, some of which are not yet being widely discussed. If I can single one out, is market power and the way that we have to approach it also from a more dynamic perspective. I don't see a lot of that. So I can see why there's a lot of enthusiasm on efficiencies and in what these guidelines mean for efficiencies, but let's not forget all the rest of the text, because it's going to be important going forward. And this is the chance to shape it, because we are really listening to how to improve it.
And Danielle, I mean, picking up on that point and the point that Thomas made, I think from someone sitting here on the other side of the pond, one of the things that has come through really clearly from this discussion today is just how much this framework changes the conversation that parties can have with the commission, and how important it is to get that conversation right across all aspects of a deal right from the beginning. So clearly, lots of new and interesting things to talk about here, and we'll continue to have this conversation over the next months and years as the guidelines are implemented. For now, I will just say, Daniele, Dave, thank you so much for joining us today. It is a privilege and a treat to get the kind of inside perspective that Daniele's provided alongside some genuine analytical challenge, and it's really been a very interesting conversation. Thomas, as always, thank you for being on the podcast and bringing your practical perspective to the discussion. For those of you who've listening, if you made it all the way here to the end, the consultation on the draft guidelines is open until June 26th. The Commission has said that it is going to start applying the principles informally from now, so really no benefit to waiting. You can find additional detailed analysis on the Freshfields blog series on our website. And of course, if any of the developments we've discussed today raise questions for you about a specific deal or in general, please reach out to any of your usual Freshfields contacts. Thank you so much again to Daniele, to Dave, to Thomas for being here to talk this through. Thanks to everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time with more Essential Antitrust.